All right, so I think that after last year, all of us are well aware of the impacts that natural disasters can have on communities. And specifically, we want to talk today about the economic impacts on agriculture that these natural disasters have and the ongoing research that we're doing in the Food and Resource Economics Department related to this topic. All right, so specifically on natural disasters in Florida, this information is coming from the National Centers for Environmental Information. They're part of the NOAA. And since 1980, the state of Florida has experienced a total of 48 what they term billion-dollar natural disasters. So these are weather or climate disasters where the overall damages and costs have reached or exceeded $1 billion. The natural disasters included here are tropical cyclones, wildfire, severe weather, drought, as well as flood and winter storm or freeze events. These annually are an average of $5 to $10 billion in economic damages or losses for the state of Florida. To give you an idea of where Florida ranks with the rest of the United States, if we look over the full term from 1980 to 2017 at the average frequency per year of billion-dollar disasters, Florida averages 1.3 events over this time period per year. We are definitely not at the top. The top is Texas at 2.5 events per year, and you'll see in sort of Tornado Alley, the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic regions that experience more of this severe weather and more of these winter storm and freeze events, they have a higher number of events per year. However, if we look at the average cost per year of these billion-dollar disasters, Florida and Texas are the top two, experiencing an average of this $5 to $10 billion every year. All right, so what are the agricultural assets that are at risk? You'll see a full list there, but we have these general categories of animals, crops, infrastructure, buildings, machinery, and then even research, extension, and teaching facilities. And I want to spend just a moment talking about the difference between losses and damages. So losses are really changes in these economic flows arising from disasters. And then damages will be this total or partial destruction of physical assets and infrastructure that we would talk about in terms of maybe replacement or repair costs. So the types of agricultural losses from natural disasters, we can see direct crop and animal losses, which then result in decreased output and decreased revenues. Increased input costs in terms of maybe you have to add fertilizer or chemicals, feed, veterinary services after a natural disaster hits. There's also cleanup and other recovery costs. So these are not repair costs to buildings, but you still have to lay out some additional money in order to clean up and get your operation going again. Reduced employee earnings, business owner profits, long-term loss of market share. And then we step over to the types of agricultural damages from natural disasters. So this is crop and animal damages are destroyed trees or deceased animals. So these are things that you have to now replace, not just wait for the next growing season to come back. And then infrastructure damages, we saw them on the list before. These are damages to irrigation systems, livestock shelters, any farm equipment and machinery, things that will need to be replaced or repaired after the natural disaster. There's also a few additional considerations that we wanted to talk about. In addition to just putting an economic value on these losses or damages, there are also potential unemployment and or a decline in wages for farmers and farm workers. We heard a little bit earlier about these facilities that are sitting idle after a natural disaster for some time period. So people are not getting paid while their facility is idle. There's rises in food imports, drops in food exports, and even an increase in the level of food insecurity in a place. So if local commodities are not available in local markets, people are not getting paid, your money is stretched a little bit thinner and you're not able to provide maybe the same nutrition or the same quality and quantity of food that you were before. Damages and losses to the agriculture sector accumulate over time as a result of recurring natural disasters. So if you're hit by these types of events over and over, year after year, it constrains economic growth in the agricultural sector, especially in areas and crops that aren't able to bounce back as quickly as one growing season. And some disasters cause more agricultural losses than others. So something like a drought will cause more agricultural losses than, we don't experience them here in Florida, but something like an earthquake wouldn't have as big of an effect on the agricultural sector. And then losses vary by agricultural subsector and also by geography. So these are things that we need to keep in mind as we move towards policy implications related to natural disasters. So when we think about national strategies for disaster risk reduction that support resilience and sustainable agricultural development, we need to keep in mind these are policies that need to address disasters that cause the greatest losses. So we need to think strategically about the types of disasters that hit different regions of the US or even of the world. Design measures that are specific to the crop, livestock, fisheries and aquaculture and forestry subsectors. So these, we've just gone through how these sectors are affected differently than others, maybe tourism, other parts of the economy. And then adopt strategies that counteract the impact of disasters on sector growth. And then also this food security issue. So these are things like disaster risk reduction and resiliency, or even financing disaster risk reduction. So Alan will talk a little bit about that when we get into our case study of Hurricane Irma. And the last thing that I would like to mention here is that you'll see it in our case study as well, but effective policy is going to require crop-specific damage and loss data for the agricultural sector. And this is what we really need is systematic collection and reporting of disaster damages and losses. And I'm going to turn it over to Alan to go with the case study of Hurricane Irma, and we'll see how that is important.
Thank you, Christa, and good afternoon, everybody. It was an obvious choice to talk about Hurricane Irma as a case study in natural resource disasters to agriculture. As you all no doubt remember, Hurricane Irma that hit the U.S. September 10th and 11th last year was among the largest and most powerful storms ever in U.S. history. This thing was 400 miles wide. At one point during its life cycle in the Caribbean, it was, I believe, the most intense hurricane on record in the Atlantic Basin, with winds over 170 miles per hour. This storm affected every single community and county in the state of Florida. The map here shows the wind speed zones that from the National Hurricane Center. It made landfall in the Florida Keys as a Category 4 storm with winds over 130 miles per hour. And as it worked its way up the peninsula, thankfully it diminished in intensity. But by the time it had left the state on September 12th, it had left a trail of really unprecedented damage to the agricultural sector, particularly in the heart of the ag production region in southwest Florida, where they had Category 2, 3, and 4 storm winds, and the rains there in the red color in excess of 12 inches that caused severe flooding. So the approach that we took to evaluate the economic impacts of this event, first of all, was that UF-IFAS and Florida Department of Agriculture, USDA Farm Service Agency, and others did field assessments. They sent people out into the counties to look at the damage and reported back through the FSA flash report system. And I'll talk a little bit later about how we think that needs to be improved. But we mapped those wind speed zones that you saw on this slide onto a map of the state and the counties, and using information. This is the USDA Cropscape map that's derived from Landsat satellite imagery, and it shows the distribution of over 100 different crops throughout the state. So we're able to determine the exact geolocation of different crop production areas. Unfortunately, this mapping system was really designed for agriculture in the Midwest. It does not have very good, they don't gather data in the wintertime when we have all of our winter fruits and vegetables are in production. So we have to rely on other county level data for this mapping exercise. Then we developed, there's extensive literature on the losses, the percentage losses that occur to different kinds of assets, buildings, equipment, crops, and trees. And we looked at that and compared with the damage reports we got back from IFAS Extension and Farm Service Agency, and developed sort of a stylized breakdown of damage levels to crops in each of these hurricanes wind speed zones. So for example, in areas that had category 3 or 4 hurricanes, we assumed it was 75% crop loss. In zones with category 1 and 2 winds, 50%. In areas with tropical storm winds, 30% loss. And then we took the average yield and price information from last year, 2016, latest available data from National Ag Statistics for 2016, and used that based on the percentage loss together with acreage and yield and price information to develop a loss estimate for each major crop. And then finally, we estimated the regional economic impacts of that using our IMPLAN input-output analysis software and data set. So I'm just going to step through the estimates that we developed for each of the major ag sectors in the state. Altogether, we estimate that it was about over 500,000 acres of cropland that were affected by the category 3 and 4 hurricane, 2.8 million acres in the category 1 and 2 zone, and 2.1 million acres in the subject to tropical storm force winds. So citrus was one commodity group that was hit especially hard there in September. It's right before the beginning of the citrus harvest season. There was a lot of early fruit on the tree ready to pick, and that is just very susceptible to wind damage. Also, grapefruit, the larger fruit size, seems to be more susceptible to wind damage, and we saw higher losses there. But altogether, over 400,000 acres, that's the entire citrus bearing acreage in the state of Florida, felt at least some effect of the storm. Citrus has a value of $2,500 to $3,900 per acre, depending upon the variety. So if you multiply that out, we get a loss estimate of about $550 million. In addition to that, however, there are some other losses that we're not accounting for. We're still, in the ongoing work, we're still attempting to put a number on the tree damage and long-term loss of productivity of trees that were destroyed or flooded. Field crops, another major category that includes sugarcane, cotton, grains, oilseeds, sod, and forages. Again, most of these crops, annual crops, were near the harvest stage at the time of the storm. So the crop was subject to high levels of damage. It's over 800,000 acres of these crops grown in Florida, and of that, over 500,000 acres is sugarcane in the south central part of the state that had Category 2 and 3 storm winds. Values range widely from only $100 an acre for things like wheat and soybeans up to over $1,200 for sugarcane. So our estimate is the loss there for all field crops over $500 million, and of that, a significant part of that, over $380 million for sugarcane alone. Nursery and Greenhouse is a major sector in Florida. According to our studies, over $15 billion sales, both nursery and landscape in this state. This includes floriculture production, mostly under protective coverage in greenhouse and shade house structures, and also woody ornamentals or tree farms that are open field production. Over 46,000 acres of these crops in the state that have an average value from $11,000 up to $49,000 per acre. It's always a surprising number for people that how valuable some of these crops are on a per acre basis, particularly the intensive greenhouse production. For greenhouse crops under cover, we assumed that the losses were only half the same percentage levels as for other open field crops, but our estimate is $436 million there. Forestry, another major industry in Florida with commercial timber stands throughout the state, over 17 million acres of timberland. This part of this assessment was done by Florida Department of Agriculture. They took the data, latest available data on the timberland inventory from the USDA Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, put that together with current market prices from the Timber March South report, and their estimate was $1.6 billion in lost timber. However, we made an economic argument here that not all of that timber could have been harvested in 1 year. Typically, that volume of timber would have been harvested over a period of 5 to 10 years. So we discounted that value and then also assumed that some of that timber could be salvageable for beneficial use. So our estimate is a net annualized loss of about $261 million. Veggies and strawberries, another big industry. Fortunately, this sector was not hit as hard. We were just starting to come into the winter production season at the beginning of September. Only a small amount of acreage had been planted at that point. So we assumed a 10% loss rate on this seasonal factor here, but it's still significant. 164,000 acres of these crops at an average value of $3,000 to $34,000 per acre. That's the $34,000 is for strawberries, very high value crop. So our estimate on this fruits and vegetables is a $72 million loss. There are some additional loss damages we're not accounting for yet, damages to mulch growing beds and irrigation systems that had to be replaced. Some crops like melons and blueberries don't enter into this at all because those are produced at other times of the year. Livestock and animal products were also affected, although fortunately not as much as most crops. This assessment again was done by FDACS. They did surveys of beef cattle producers and dairy farms. They attempted to account for direct production losses like dead animals that were killed outright in the storm due to exposure, lost weight of young beef cattle that are waiting shipment. In some cases, these animals, because the roads were washed out and the ranch hands, employee families weren't available, they had to be held for an extra couple weeks with inadequate feed, so they lost a lot of weight, and the ranchers don't get paid until the animals are delivered to their final destination. And then also some of the dairies that lost power and lost refrigeration had to dump milk. So altogether, we reckon that was about a $39 million loss. The pastures on ranches probably minimally affected, but there are some additional infrastructure damages to farm buildings that we did not account for in this number. So then just to summarize, for all of these major commodity groups, the overall loss estimate is $1.86 billion with a B, which represents roughly 1/4 of the total annual output value of agriculture and forestry in the state of Florida. And then when you consider the regional economic multiplier effects of those direct losses, that those revenue decreases to farm producers that and the loss of income to other allied sectors as that money gets respent in the Florida economy. The direct effects there is just the revenue losses in the ag sector. The indirect effects, the loss of income to the supply chain industries, the machinery dealer, the fuel station, the pest, ag chemical dealers and so forth that are providing inputs to ag production, and then the induced effects of lost household income and government tax revenues that would normally get respent in the state economy and generate additional economic activity. So we add all those together, direct, indirect, and induced. Our estimate is over 55,000 full-time and part-time jobs lost, over $2.3 billion in lost labor income, wages, salaries, and benefits to employees and business owners, $3.7 billion lost in total value added or gross contribution to gross domestic product of the state of Florida, and $6.5 billion in total industry output or business revenues. And in addition to that, the model allows us to estimate impacts on state and local and federal governments. It's about $214 million loss in state and local taxes, then sales tax, property tax, motor fuels tax, excise taxes, and others, and about $580 million in loss in federal government taxes, mainly for personal and corporate income taxes and payroll taxes. So since our report came out in early October, we've endeavored to try to assess the accuracy of this information. After all, these initial estimates we made had a lot of assumptions about the damage levels. So we've been gathering data on actual ag product movement and prices over the last 5 months. This is the latest available citrus production forecast that comes out every month from the USDA National Ag Statistics Service. It's considered a highly reliable source. The February forecast here, numbers shown here, in past years have had only a 10% margin of error in compared to end of the season actual production numbers. So we feel pretty confident that these numbers are good going forward. You see there for the different citrus varieties, change in production from last year to this year ranges from about 35% up to 47%. Overall weighted average there is 35% because it's dominated by the oranges, the largest crop. There has been some controversy about this. The organizations like Florida Citrus Mutual think that these numbers are too high. They've suggested based on surveys of their members that the citrus crop could be as low as 31 million boxes this year. So we'll see in a few months what the actual number is, but it points out that if you just look at the difference between the 15-16 and 16-17 actual numbers, you can see that this is all in the context of the devastation of citrus greening disease that's been reducing citrus production for over 10 years now. So this makes our job extra difficult to try to assess the impact of just a single weather event. These are the data on citrus fruit deliveries to processing plants. As you know, over 90% of Florida citrus production is processed for juice. You see there the red line is the data to date up through the end of January, and then the blue line is the deliveries for the past season. Notice the big dip there in the middle of the season, which occurs when the processing plants shift over from early mid-fruit to the later citrus varieties like Valencia. But the real story there is the big shortfall in deliveries this year. Altogether, it's down by about 28% from the previous year. But we think that that number is probably low if you consider the fact that the processing has been completed quicker this year. The eventual total processed citrus volume will probably be likely closer to something like a 40% decrease. Similar picture here for the fresh citrus shipments. This is also tracked by both by Florida Department of Citrus and USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. The green line there is for the current market year, 2017-18, and compared to the previous 2 years, you can see that the volumes are down significantly. It's about a 38% decrease from the previous year. This is the summary of results from a survey of citrus growers that we did together in cooperation with the Florida Department of Citrus, in which we got data from about 30 growers all throughout the state that represent over 81,000 acres, so pretty decent sample. The overall average there is about a 51% loss of crops on bearing acreage. It's more for grapefruit than for oranges or specialty fruit. And then also about 7% of citrus trees were destroyed. That's just trees absolutely destroyed, torn out of the ground, have to be bulldozed. There's probably a lot more trees that were damaged, had limb damage and reduced production, and also groves that were flooded for several weeks that are going to be less productive for years to come. This is the data on bulk movement of fresh fruits and vegetables out of the state, again from the Agriculture Marketing Service. The red line there is the data to date through January of this year for this winter season compared to last year. You can see we're down about 37%, so remarkably consistent number, matches very closely with what we see in the citrus sector. But we'll see what happens in the next couple months as we approach that peak shipping period in May of this year. In addition to the product movement, you have to also consider prices. Because guess what? It makes a difference. Laws of supply and demand come into play here. When there's reduced production, prices tend to rise. So these are the data on vegetables. You see there, compare the volume change, price change, and total value, price times quantity, for this season through January of this winter season versus the same period last year. For all the crops, the volume change was negative, ranging from around as low as 20% up to over around 60%, whereas the price change was positive. In all cases, there was some market price compensation for the reduced supply available. So, but then in terms of value, the actual dollar values there shown in the right-hand columns, and then the value change is a mixed bag. For some crops, it's up. For some crops, it's down. But overall, the total value of all these commodities that have the comparable information for both years is remarkably close. No change. So this tells me that at least in the case of the vegetable sector, this industry is very resilient. The vegetable guys came back right away and replanted, and it looks like they're going to have a decent season this year, at least in terms of total income. Now, the loss of volume could be a problem, and that could mean some loss of market share in the long run. We just don't know. Crop insurance. There's been some discussion today already about crop insurance. As most of you know, there's been a very significant trend in federal farm policy over the last few years, moving away from the old price support and subsidies toward crop insurance as a safety net for farmers. More of a market-based, model orientation. So you see there on the left table the summary of indemnities, that is insurance settled loss values, although they're not necessarily paid yet, by cause of loss. And there's three major causes of loss that can be attributed to hurricanes and tropical storms. Not only the one called hurricane, tropical depression, but sometimes it gets coded by the risk management agency as excess precipitation or excess wind. So you have to consider those together. And then the right-hand table is a more limited subset of the data by specific crop and rank ordered in terms of indemnity for just those three causes of loss that could be attributed to Hurricane Irma, and just for the last 4 months of the year, September, October, November, and December of 2017, months that were in principle affected by the Hurricane Irma. And this was surprising to me, actually, that the total indemnity value there, just under $17 million, really quite low, less than 1% of the total loss value that we estimated that is actually covered by federal crop insurance. So I think there may need to be some better way to manage risk for Florida growers. I think crop insurance is part of the maybe part of the solution, but certainly is not a sufficient one in itself. Now, there may still be some crop insurance claims outstanding. Growers have up to 6 months to file claims, so up through March of this year, there still may be claims coming in. But these data that we got from I was assured by the regional administrator of the RMA in Valdosta that these are the correct data for Florida for last year. Want to just briefly touch on the legislative situation. As was mentioned earlier, we're very fortunate that we did get legislation in the Congress to provide disaster relief. It was 2.36 billion in ad hoc assistance to be administered by USDA. That's part of a broader $3.6 billion effort that includes some other things too, like conservation program funding. But we're very proud that UF-IFAS had a role in this. In our report that came out in early October was the basis for the request for federal disaster assistance by Commissioner Putnam's office that went forward in November. And then finally, as was mentioned, we got the bill passed in the House in December, and then finally in the Senate in February of this year. So I'm just going to kind of summarize a few key points here. That these disasters are becoming more and more frequent, and it's something that we need to seriously consider as part of the normal business of agriculture in this state. You got to distinguish between damages and losses. It makes a difference whether you count those infrastructure damages as well as direct production losses. Some of the data we have for specialty winter crops in Florida is not as good as we'd like. Sometimes the damages appear worse than they really are. When you send somebody out to do a windshield survey in the counties, usually they're looking at the edges of fields, which take the brunt of the wind, and the crops inside the field block may not be as affected as badly. You have to consider market prices too, as well as volume changes. And it's difficult to assess the impact of a single event like a hurricane in the context of industries like citrus that are rapidly changing. It's difficult to know what the baseline is there. And then finally, we're looking now at developing some new tools for more rapid assessment of these impacts. Typically, we need these numbers within days or weeks, not months, in order to be policy relevant. So, Christa, if you would come up and.
So we're in the proposal stage for a lot of future developments, and one of them is a GIS application for rapid assessment. So we're thinking of a software tool that has scalable maps where you could go in and identify a disaster area, and then it would quickly tell you what types of assets are there in terms of buildings, crops, livestock, and then also have a built-in regional economic model that could tell you the economic impacts quickly. Those are not going to be something that are ready to go in the next month or so, but we're hoping to get through the proposal stage for the next hurricane season. We were talking with it's the state agricultural response team. It would be more like emergency management officials, I think. And they would be the ones that would have the ability to edit data. But anybody, I think eventually if we were to roll out a mobile app version, anybody could access the information, not change the information.
Except extension wants it within 24, 48 hours, so it's really hard for us to do it when we're stuck at the hurricane centers.
Yeah.
Well, you're referring to, you're with extension, so I guess extension is contacting you and asking you for numbers. That's one challenge. FSA has another format they want their information. The State Emergency Management has another format. FEMA has another format. RMA has another format. That's also one of the challenges here. How do we start to harmonize the information? So we don't go and ask you, fill out these 5 different formats. And so and that's something we're talking about now as well. Because, the folks on the ground aren't able to get out. You have your own families to deal with. You may be bound to a particular place because the event is still in process. So those are other challenges. I think maybe you can mention this one other thing, this crowdsourcing aspect of getting data.
Sure. So we're also actively working with the UF1 Health Center of Excellence. They have experts there on data analysis, big data, artificial intelligence, deep learning type information. And we're also in the proposal stage there to write a piece of software that crowdsources drone. People could fly their drones pre and post disaster and upload that information. And then the computer software will take care of sort of harmonizing that, identifying crops, identifying buildings, and then going in to assess these damages. So one aspect that we didn't really talk about today is this infrastructure damage. That's even harder to get data on than the crop losses and the crops. So it will actually accomplish 2 things: give us a better information on the specialty crops that are grown in Florida, since we talked about those being a problem within the cropscape data that we're currently using, and then also tack on this piece of infrastructure losses as well.
Any other questions right now? Well, let's thank Alan and Christa.